Love seeing a lot of good fellowship in the house this morning. Dave gave me 3 chapters to cover today, so I figured we better get started so we don't have you here till 1 o'clock this afternoon. He told me at least 1:30, but we'll do 1 o'clock since I have the 3 chapters. And no, actually, not that much, but we do have a fair amount to cover. And so before we jump in, Dave actually came up this morning when I walked in, and he commented on the pink shirt. And so I said, there's a story behind it, and I'll get there. So if y'all remember, probably about a month ago, maybe longer, Pastor Dave was up here, and he had commented that Zach and Jason and Sean were giving him a hard time because of the pinkish color to his shirt. And so this morning I thought, I'm going to wear a pink shirt and see if those 3 men think that they're man enough to comment on my shirt. And not one of them did. Not one of them had the backbone to give me a ribbon for my pink shirt. So we're good to go this morning. Brother Danny, he complimented me on it. So Danny, thank you, sir. You bet. Appreciate that. All right. This morning I want to cover 4 key greater thans that are in the first part of Matthew chapter 12. But before we jump into Matthew 12, I first want to backtrack for just a bit this morning to go back to what Pastor Dave covered last week at the end of chapter 11. I just want to do that so we can get into the context of where we go in the first half of chapter 12. And so in chapter 11, 28 to 30, if you'll remember, this is when Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle in heart. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." And so this call that Jesus has to pick up his yoke and with the light burden, that call goes out to all of us who are tired and weary of being crushed under the weight of expectations, being crushed under the weight of duties and requirements that have been placed on us by systems and structures. And so Jesus says, take my yoke. And of course, we all know that the yoke is the very tool that is made to carry heavy weight. It's used to assist us in carrying heavy loads. He says, use my yoke to carry the weight because my yoke is easy. And the word easy here actually means useful, suitable, or comfortable. So the easier the yoke, the less burdensome the weight. And that makes sense because if you're going to use a yoke, which we don't use in these days anymore, but a yoke that would go across the shoulders and carry maybe buckets or piles of wood or whatever is being carried, we realize that the better the yoke, the more that the yoke fits us, the more that it's equipped to us, the easier it is to carry heavy loads. So a bad-fitting yoke makes it difficult to carry even a light load, a light burden. Whereas a yoke that fits properly, a yoke that has been made for us, actually makes it easier to carry a heavier burden. So in reality, Jesus is saying, I'm going to give you the right tool for the job. Let me give you the tool that's the right tool for the job, and if you'll use the tool that I give you, then the burden actually is going to be easy to bear. So I tend to, I'm a simple guy, so I sometimes have to have things in my mind to look at and think about. So if I was to tell you this morning that I was going to build a house, and I was going to frame the house myself, this hammer will be effective, right? I can drive a nail with it, okay? The problem is I can have this hammer or this hammer that's an actual framing hammer. This one's quite a bit heavier, okay? This one has a whole lot more weight than this hammer. So if I don't know what I'm doing and say I want to build a house, I pick this one up and say, wow, I can swing this one all day because it's nice and light, and this hammer's kind of heavy. I don't think I want to swing this heavy hammer all day. The problem is I'm going to have to swing this one about 20 times for the amount of time I have to swing this one. So both of these tools will do the job, but how many of you know that if I pick up this bad boy, Tim the Toolman Taylor here, this one is a whole lot better to frame a house with because it's a matter of pulling the trigger. I'm not swinging. I'll tell you, this one weighs about 20 times what this weighs. However, I can do a whole lot more work, carry a whole lot more burden, do a whole lot better job with the heaviest tool that's up here. You say, wow, that doesn't make sense. It's what Jesus, I think, is getting at. He says, if you'll take my yoke, if you'll pick up this hammer instead of the easy one, the one that's light, guess what? You'll be equipped to do so much more. You'll be able to carry and bear and do the burdens that I've given you to carry. But so often in our lives, we want to pick up the lightest thing that's on the table, and then we struggle because we're worn out. Jesus said, if you'll just pick up the air hammer, if you'll just hook it into the compressor, if you just use that one, you're not going to get worn out. You're wearing yourself out by not using the right tool. So the best tool for the job is actually the biggest and the heaviest, but it's also the one that makes the job the least burdensome. So why does Jesus have that conversation at that moment? We're going to pick up going into Matthew chapter 12. Starting at verse 1, he says that about that time, Jesus was walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. The disciples were hungry, so they began breaking off some heads of grain and eating them. But some Pharisees saw them do it and protested, "Look, your disciples are breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath." Jesus said to them, "Haven't you read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God, and he and his companions broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. And haven't you read in the law of Moses that the priests on duty in the temple may work on the Sabbath? I tell you, there's one here who is even greater than the temple. But you would not have condemned my innocent disciples if you knew the meaning of this scripture. I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. For the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath." And so the Pharisees, the religious elite, had enough of this upstart by the name of Jesus. He was disrupting their entire system, their entire way of thought. He was disrupting their control over the people and their way of life. And so they began to watch and look for an opportunity where they could challenge Jesus and find him in violation of the law so they could bring him into the synagogue to be accused. First of all, recognize that Jesus and his disciples had done absolutely nothing wrong. You might look at this in today's context and say, seriously, like he and his disciples are walking through another guy's field and they just decide to start ripping up wheat and eating it. Like, who does that? They're trespassing, they're stealing from this guy, except for the fact that way back in Deuteronomy chapter 23, there are allowances that are made for when people are traveling, when they're walking through. You were permitted to walk through another person's field. And if you were hungry, you were actually permitted to eat from their vineyard or to eat from their field, but it was only what you could eat in that moment. So you didn't decide to take along a 5-gallon bucket and pull all their grapes and say, I'm good to go now. No, you could eat what was what they called it, what was in their hand. You could eat to your fill for what you needed, but you didn't take anything that your neighbor had home to your house. Does that make sense? And so that provision was in the law because things were a whole lot different then and now. You didn't just drive in the car and go to Walmart when you were hungry. You may be traveling from to your neighbor's house. It may be miles. And along the way, if the grain is good to go, you could grab a handful of grain, and there was no violation of the law in that. You see, God's law given to Moses was to keep the Sabbath holy as a day of rest and to do no work on it. But as time progressed, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees added to the law. Man, how often do we do that? We add to what God said. Adam and Eve started that, didn't they? They added to what God had said. So the rabbis, the Pharisees, they added 39 specific restrictions for the Sabbath. Actually, there's more based on the residual effect. So things like you could write one letter, but not two. So you could write an A on the Sabbath, but you couldn't write a B because that was 2 letters, all right? And by the way, you weren't allowed to pick up a tool or an implement that would be used to write. So technically, you couldn't write any letters because if you picked up a pen or a pencil, you were already in violation. You could sew 1 stitch, but not 2. But you couldn't touch the needle because that was the tool or the implement that was used, so technically you couldn't even sew. You could make 1 loop in thread, but you couldn't make 2. You couldn't start a fire, nor could you extinguish a fire. You couldn't tie something, you couldn't untie something. And specific to this incident, you were not allowed to harvest, sift, or grind grain. And so by pulling the heads of grain and separating them or sifting them from the stems and chewing the kernels, the Pharisees decided that Jesus had reaped, sifted, and grinded grain on the Sabbath. These Pharisees, what a bunch of guys. You can't make this stuff up. What a crew they were. Kind of like getting COVID on dry sand but not wet. Kind of like you can use a canoe but not a powerboat. Kind of like you can be 6 feet away from somebody and talk to them but not 5.5 feet. I probably just better move on, Dave. Rather than arguing the law with these guys, Jesus reminds them of 2 instances where a violation of the law actually occurred. He talks about the time when David was running for his life, and he and his men are hungry, and they stop at the temple, the tabernacle. And the priest says, the only food I have for you guys is what's called the showbread, the holy bread that was set before the Lord. And David said, but that food has been removed from the holy place, and it has since touched things that aren't holy. So is it then not lawful? Can we not eat that bread? And the priest said, absolutely, you can eat that bread. And they were determined to not be in violation of the law. And then Jesus talks about another instance where the priests are allowed to do the work in the tabernacle, or in Jesus' day in the temple. They're allowed to sacrifice. They're allowed to clean things, light things, put things out with candles. They could do all the work of the temple, but they were not in violation of the law because they were doing their duties. The Pharisees couldn't argue with either one of these points. Jesus had them. There's nothing that they could argue with on that. And then after that, Jesus kind of sets a zinger. And he reminds them of what the prophets Hosea and Micah said. And in that, Jesus reminds them with his verse. He said, if you had known what it means that mercy is desired over sacrifice, you would not have condemned these men who are without guilt. Because you see, the prophets Hosea and Micah, their words from the Lord were, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So the first greater than that we come to in Matthew chapter 12 is that mercy is greater than sacrifice. Mercy is greater than sacrifice. How many times have we been in a place where we have had the option to exercise mercy or just hammer someone? And we'd be justified to hammer them. You see, there's a lot of times in my life I would rather give something up or sacrifice something than to show someone mercy. I'd rather climb Horn Peak barefoot in the snow than to extend mercy sometimes. I was going to be real. We'll sacrifice going to a great restaurant because we're afraid we're going to run into someone that we don't want to talk to because they wronged us or hurt us or offended us, and we'd rather not talk to them, so we'll give up going to a great restaurant rather than showing mercy. The Pharisees justified themselves by their sacrifice, by the things they gave up, by the things they would not do. And they felt that that justified them rather than showing mercy. You know, the list of things that they gave up on the Sabbath was amazing. 39 things, actually far more with the residual that they were not allowed to do. Interestingly enough, we know that these rules were made by men. Sue's probably going to kill me for saying this because I was laughing on the way in this morning about this. We know these rules were made up by men because of all the things you were not allowed to do. You were actually supposed to have sex on the Sabbath because that was restful and good for the soul. All the ladies are laughing, like, leave it up to a guy to say, at least one day a week, I'm getting something, all right? You're saying, I can't believe he's talking about that in church. It's in the Bible, okay? It's there. So they have all these laws, but Jesus comes along with that, and he said that the best thing, the best tool to lighten the burden is to show mercy rather than to subject oneself to sacrifice as justification for knocking someone in the teeth. The best tool is mercy, as opposed to the weight of carrying judgment or lack of mercy. And then Jesus goes on to verse 8. He refers to himself. He says, the Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath. And this gets us really quick to our second one, is that Jesus is greater than tradition. Jesus is greater than tradition. You see, the Sabbath day was no longer a holy day. It had nothing to do with a holy day set aside before the Lord to celebrate his goodness. The Sabbath had become a day of tradition. It had become a day of law. It had become a day of heavy weight for the people. The teaching of men had overtaken the teaching of God. Sabbath, or Shabbat, as it is in the Hebrew, was to be for two things. First of all, Sabbath was to be for rest. And second, it was to be connected with another word, I don't know how to actually say it, Zakor, which means to remember. It was to remember the deliverance that they had from Egypt. So when you put those two together, the Sabbath was to be a day of rest and freedom, a day of rest and freedom. But it had become a day of stress and bondage to tradition. There was nothing holy about the Sabbath anymore. And ironically, in the Shabbat liturgy, what the priest or the rabbi, what they would recite on the Sabbath is rest that is linked in the same breath to holiness. Linked in the same breath to holiness. Holiness. Let's talk about holiness for a minute. When I say holiness, all sorts of things probably popped into your mind. And depending on your background and tradition, the way you were raised, holiness for you may be a lot of do's and don'ts, things that are permitted or not permitted, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. You see, in man's system, holiness comes from rituals, it comes from recited prayers, it comes from avoidance of specific things or being required to do other things. We reach God by being holy in that system. God is reached somehow by being holy. If I can be holy enough, I can come into God's presence. If I'm holy enough, if I do the right things, if I have the right actions, if I have the right external display, if I show up for this and do this or don't do that, I can come into God's presence. But holiness is dependent on man. In Jesus' system, holiness rises out of relationship with Him. It's completely opposite. So if I walk in relationship with Jesus, then the automatic effect of that is that holiness begins to well up in me, because the more time I spend with Jesus, the more of Jesus is in me, the more holiness from the inside out is displayed in my life. I become holy by being with Jesus. I don't get to Jesus by being holy. Relationship births holiness, while religious tradition brings death. So the best tool to lighten the burden is to leave religious tradition for a relationship with Jesus Christ. And I want to move on to verses 9 to 13. And these verses detail the next dust-up that Jesus has with the Pharisees. So Jesus goes over to the synagogue where he noticed a man with a deformed hand. And the Pharisees asked Jesus, "Does the law permit a person to work by healing on the Sabbath?" They were hoping that he would say yes, so they could bring charges against him. You'll recall from earlier teachings that in Jesus' time, if someone was sick, if they were poor, if they were in prison, everybody believed that it was a result either of their sin or a sin that their parents had committed. So anyone who was sick, anyone who was born with a birth defect, they were blind, any of those things, it was believed that they did not have God's blessing because of sin in their life or in their parents' life. And it's interesting enough because in other restrictions the Pharisees added to the Sabbath, ironically enough, is that you were not allowed to heal on the Sabbath. Because healing was a work of creation or new creation, which was not permitted on the Sabbath. You could heal in the case of imminent death, or if there wasn't a healing, the person would die. But any other sort of healing could wait till either Friday or do it on Friday or wait till Sunday, because you could just as easy heal them on another day of the week. Imagine that. A holy day that is set aside for freedom and for rest, but you weren't allowed to give somebody freedom and rest from their sickness on the Sabbath. It shows us just how far skewed and out of bounds this was. So Jesus answers with this, back in verse 11. "If you had a sheep that fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you work to pull it out? Of course you would. And how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Yes, the law permits a person to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored, just like the other one. Then the Pharisees called a meeting to plot how to kill Jesus. So with the sheep, again, Jesus brings up an exemption to the Sabbath law. He says, if an animal falls into a pit, you're permitted to rescue it, which was permitted in the Mosaic law. He was quick to point out that if you could rescue a sheep from a well, wouldn't it make sense that a human life was far more valuable? Which brings us to the third greater than, which is restoration is greater than judgment. You see, the Pharisees could either stand in judgment of what they perceived to be sin in this man's life and say, you get what you deserve. This is because of you or your family. Or they could move to restore him. And I have another thought as it pertains to the sheep in the well. Sheep often depict us in the New Testament. How often, let's be real, how often do we look at a believer that has fallen in a pit, and we say, if you had been in church more, you wouldn't be stuck. Guess you figured out what reaping and sowing is. I saw this coming. I've seen the way you've been acting. If you pray more, if you volunteer more, if you would, we shake our heads, we'll wag our fingers, and we'll use that poor sap as an example rather than to do what the Bible says, which is to gently restore that person. But we're content to leave them in the well. They got themselves in, they can get themselves out. I'm on my way to church. I need to go have devotions. I need to go have my worship time. I need to go witness to somebody. I don't have time to get that sheep out of the well. Hurts. I'm speaking to myself here. Trust me. Jesus restored the man. He says, stretch out your hand. And the man was healed. Think about the freedom in this man's life. We think about it as a withered hand that was healed. In Jesus' time, there was a clean hand and an unclean hand. One of his hands he couldn't use. He didn't have a clean hand. People weren't going to shake his hand. They weren't going to take money from him. He couldn't touch anyone because his hand was unclean. He was bound up. Jesus restored the man. And the Pharisees, in their usual fashion, mad as wet hens, they run off and begin to plot how they can kill Jesus. Think about it. This group of people in a place of moral superiority, casting judgment on everybody and their brother, trying to trap Jesus in a violation of the Sabbath, on the Sabbath day, go out and plot a murder. Man, we got to be careful. In our place of judgment, I'm here to tell you, sin is right at the door. When we stand in a place of judgment, we will step into a place of sin so quickly and not even realize it. Another interesting thing with the 39 things that were not allowed to happen on the Sabbath. Remember I said they weren't allowed to start a fire? That was actually not just a physical fire, but they actually wrote that you could not start a fire, nor were you to stir up controversy, were you to defame another person. Basically, don't start fires with people. And here they are plotting a murder. They were right back where Cain was in Genesis. Cain, who stood in judgment of his brother's sacrifice. And God said, Cain, be careful, because sin is crouching at your door. You've got to be careful in that place of judgment. Then going to verses 15 to 21. But Jesus knew what they were planning, so he left that area. Sorry, I forgot to come back to just that one point there. So the best thing then, the best tool with restoration being greater than judgment, the best tool is to lighten the burden, is to forego standing in judgment of one and deference to restoring them. Because we'll carry a burden if we stand in judgment, but we'll lighten that burden. We will lighten that load if we will work to restore that person. Go on to verses 15 to 21. But Jesus knew what they were planning. They were planning his murder. So he left that area, and many people followed him. He healed all the sick among them, but he warned them not to reveal who he was. This fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah concerning him. Look at my servant whom I have chosen. He is my beloved who pleases me. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not fight or shout or raise his voice in public. He will not crush the weakest reed or put out a flickering candle. Finally, he will cause justice to be victorious, and his name will be the hope of all the world. So these verses tell us that Jesus continued to heal. It didn't matter the pushback that was starting. This really is the first case where Jesus began to see pushback in his ministry. We realize that John the Baptist had already been in prison, but as far as anyone coming after Jesus specifically, this is really the first time that the Pharisees begin to push back. And so he continues to heal. He continues to minister. He doesn't back down, but he specifically tells people not to reveal who he was. Why? Because there was a specific prophecy about Jesus as the Messiah. You see, the prophet Isaiah said the Messiah would proclaim justice, but he would not fight or shout or raise his voice, which is where we find the fourth and the final greater than. Action is greater than argument. Action is greater than argument. You see, the prophecy is that Jesus would proclaim justice, but yet he wouldn't fight, shout, or raise his voice. How could he proclaim justice to the nations and face opposition, but yet not engage in shouting, verbal battles, and heated arguments? It's because action always trumps argument. Actions are always louder than words. We talk about faith, but if there's no action, the Bible says it's dead. We talk about loving God and loving people, but if there's no evidence, we are mute. Go back to Jesus' words with John the Baptist's disciples when John sent word and said, "Are you really the Messiah? Are you really the one?" See, Jesus didn't outline the words and the arguments of the prophets to prove he was Jesus. He didn't go into a 3-hour theological discourse to prove himself. He simply said, "Go tell John what's been happening. The lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." Jesus didn't argue his point. He simply said, tell them what you see. Look at the actions. Actions are greater than argument. But my gracious, how quick, if we're not careful, that we will be to argue and fight and shout and yell and struggle, especially in this cancel culture that we're in. Begin to raise our voice. Who's got the loudest voice as opposed to who's got the actions? Who's got the actions? The best thing, the best tool to lighten the burden is to forego argument and to step into action. Forego argument and step into action. Zach, if you'll come and get ready to close us out. I'm tired, I'm weary, I'm struggling as I look at our nation, as I look at our culture, as I look at the Americanized church. It's hard, it's tough, it's agonizing. I've gotten to the point where you might as well not even look at much of the news, social media, those things, because instantly it just begins to well up. Tired. We're exhausted. We're saying, what is happening? Where are we going? What will be there for our kids and our grandkids? Why am I in that place? Why are we in that place? Why is it happening? I believe it's because I've put on the lesser than as opposed to the greater than yoke. I've picked this up when I need to do this work. I've picked up the lesser than as opposed to the greater than that Jesus desires me to pick up. It's not useful. It's not suitable. It's not comfortable. It's not the right tool for the job, and therefore everything is rubbing me the wrong way. Am I the only one? Is anybody else just being completely rubbed the wrong way in this day and in this time? What's around your neck? Whose yoke is it? Is your neck rubbed raw and your shoulders sore? Why? It's because we're not wearing the yoke for which we were fitted. We've not picked up the tool, the yoke that Jesus says, this is what I want you to wear. And if you wear this, you'll be able to carry this. Amen. You'll be able to do the work I've given you to do. Zach?
All right, if anyone needs prayer,